Callaghan is an Executive Director and Chairman of the Yaran Group of companies. He's an Aboriginal man whose Aboriginal family originally came from the Tassajara region of South Australia. He is from an extended Potawatomi family that comes originally from Padsaway or Tassajara region. I can't think of anyone better to kick off our conference than Rick, who's going to be talking about the economic imperative of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander First Nations land and sea Landcare programs within Australia. Let's give Rick a warm welcome. Thanks, Rick.
Matakaru. I'd respectfully acknowledge the Australian First Peoples whose land I work on every day, and there is no place in Australia that has not been known, nurtured and loved, be it the sea, land or air, by its First Peoples. I acknowledge my people, the Potawatomi people, who are the custodians of this place here that we meet today. And I acknowledge my elders past and present and emerging, and I thank them for allowing me to present here today, which is, makes my heart jump with glee. My presentation here today very broadly examines the First Nations Ranger programs. I've got a lot of administrative type work that I do in that area as opposed to the day-to-day grind, and I respect those people that are out on the ground every day doing the hard work, I call it. I have to do most of the intellectual type of thinking in this sort of space with my cohorts around the country, and there's a lot of people that do it far better than I do it. The program currently employs First Nations peoples as rangers around Australia to undertake land and waterway management activities such as biodiversity monitoring. I'm going to apologise, I am going to read. I'm not going to look up quite as much as they say you should. I've been busy. I did Melbourne, Sydney, Darwin, Adelaide and here in the last 6-7 days, so you'll bear with me. Basically, activities such as biodiversity monitoring, research, capturing traditional knowledge, fire, cultural sites, feral animal and weed management, cultural awareness experiences, employment within visitor and cultural centres, and tourism ventures, providing educative programs for all. I'm going to be a little bit controversial, as I believe there appears to be a perceived level of unconscious bias within the bureaucracy and the mainstream levels of government and other well-intentioned peoples at times, not necessarily with those dedicated people, as I stated before, that work on the ground in the day-to-day capacities with our people, but those people that manage the dollars and cents. And you can spell sense with S-E as well. I contend that the evidence is that there are more than enough room for shared or full management of First Nations ranger programs that manage land and sea projects by the First Nations peoples and groups in all their forms. I believe that the bias is that they, and I'm going to generalise here, the senior management teams of government and governments don't think we are capable of performing the same level of the mainstream, and I think that's the underlying bias. People may disagree with me, but that's my contention. I contend that more economic inputs and hand-off roles by government will ensure a more developed approach by all governments that will assist First Nation communities to identify land management priorities and opportunities, build community and organisational capacity, and invest in direct training opportunities, especially from a sustainable cultural, economic and social perspective. Economic opportunities such as visitor interactive centres are very important. And they give an opportunity to build community and organisational capacity, invest in direct training opportunities, especially from a sustainable cultural and economic and social perspective. Economic opportunities such as visitor and interactive cultural centres, galleries, accommodation and tourism ventures, and the ability to be collectors of revenue at park entrances with regards to fees for camping, site access and the facility accesses across all land tenures is also an important economic driver. In a number of states and territories, a number of these ranger programs have been driven by mining or other royalties, which sort of conflicts with the fact they're digging the ground up, but they're supposed to be good land carriers because they've got all this, all of the regulations and requirements to remediate the damage they're doing. Basically what's happening is that with these royalties that the traditional owners are being asked to use their native title compensations to fund and provide co-funding for the establishment of these programs. I would argue the government needs to do more, and they shouldn't be using their compensation for the destruction of the ground to have to build up their ranger programs. Obviously, first ranger programs provide employment programs to provide new jobs, protect the environment and provide social and economic benefits to the people in the sometimes urban, regional and remote areas. Traditional owner groups and landcare bodies in all states and through the state and Commonwealth illustrate that through their respective departments of conservation, natural resources or parks or wildlife teams, that the social, cultural, economic and environmental benefits of Aboriginal ranger programs have far exceeded expectation and have been far and wide-reaching, but in many cases it's non-Indigenous people making these statements. Over thousands of years, First Nations people have developed and harnessed knowledge that strengthens the environmental sustainability and fosters cultural well-being. First Nations Rangers programs have drawn upon this knowledge and connection to country to protect and manage land, sea and country across Australia. I've been told that there are over 100 separate First Nations ranger groups in Australia. I did see a map produced in regards to women rangers recently, and that was for men and women, and that was a good effort to think that there was over 100. This illustrates that we're doing more, we are doing more, but this is a big country with a huge landscape, landcare issues, and we'll hear about here today over the next few days. First Nations people have shaped and managed land and sea country for tens of thousands of years, and this connection to country is a crucial element of Australian First Nations culture. It is also a gift for Australian culture in general and for the management of our landscapes. As well as the cultural reinforcement of environmental management, over 80% of the ranger groups are involved in specific cultural activities. They are the protectors of significant sites such as rock art, waterholes, fish traps, eel traps, burial sites, and are managed as required by the individual groups and by their traditional owner groups. Many stories are now being recorded and maintained for their children and their children's children. Rangers from around Australia often share their stories where it is culturally appropriate. That is about how they, and in their work is how they're reinforcing their culture for them specifically. When people see the beauty of our sunburnt country, and I ripped that off Dorothy McKellar, they see the strength of our culture. The country is alive because we still hold the stories. Dances and songlines of life tightly and are handing them down to our young people. I had the opportunity to go through traditional law and culture, and the only sad part is that I had to do it some 3,000 kilometres away. First Nations Rangers are highly skilled, professional land and sea managers working in First Nations protected areas and or on traditional lands across Australia. They use traditional practices and more often they're using more modern science to protect, nurture and restore the landscape. We're not averse to using modern science. I'll dispel that theory straight away that they stick to the old forms of maintenance because there are better ways of doing things. But they're also a vital cog in helping preserve and celebrate First Nations culture, language and links to country. First Nations ranger groups are active in their specific cultural activities in and around their traditional lands, and this means that they are preserving and maintaining their rock art, as I said before, their traps and the like. Just as importantly, First Nation rangers have become role models for a new generation. They're living examples of workforce participation, of healthier lifestyles and of involvement in cultural preservation. Funding for First Nation ranger programs has in many regions not been locked in and not certain beyond 2020-21. I'm happy to be told otherwise, but recently I couldn't find any evidence that they were being given more funds, but I'm happy to be told otherwise. The Australian Government needs to create and increase funding in a sustainable way, and it needs to make sure that this is done sooner rather than later. I personally think that the economics from a white fella perspective is still not truly known if you're only speaking dollars and cents. My knowledge and involvement in this space has been primarily through the Bungemma Ranger Management Program up in the Karijini National Park, which is located roughly halfway between Tom Price and Newman. We used to call it Naparu Town because it's name aversion stuff, but which is in the Pilbara region. It's about 2 hours flight north of Perth. In many cases, the ranger programs across Australia have provided an integral step towards improving community wellbeing and reducing poverty through economic opportunities and building leadership in remote and regional communities. From an economic perspective, the Karijini National Park, which is the second largest national park by size in WA, receives about 75,000 to 100,000 visitors a year with almost no advertising. The Carrageenan Visitor Centre was built primarily through Bunjbi, Inawonga and Eastern Guruma people's perseverance, but is located in Mudjabunjaba country. The gorges and valleys and waterholes of this area are world-class environmental space that incorporates rock art and special places that are sacred and secret to the Aboriginal custodians. The ranger programs across WA in general will and currently employ Aboriginal people as rangers to undertake land and sea management activities such as biodiversity monitoring and research, traditional knowledge transfer, fire management, feral animal and weed management, cultural awareness and immersion experiences for visitors, guided and welcome to country tours and talks for visitors, management of visitors, tourists and tourism assets, and education programs and mentoring. But the government arbiters or controlling departments in a number of states are still struggling to come to terms with the meaningful and sustainable models of control and ownership. They are invariably still struggling to make full control and commercial agreements with the traditional owners as to the ownership and operation of these parks. And I think Uluru is a prime example of that. It's taken them 30 odd years to allow a transition to some of the wishes and things that the traditional owners have always wanted. Just like in the States are doing a great job in a lot of ways. I mean, it's not my aim to denigrate them. I think a lot of the bodies and states are doing a great job, but it's just like the concept of the voice. There is still some way to go to really understand and inculcate Aboriginal ownership and control within national parks and natural environment of this country. There is, in my opinion, as has been witnessed by myself and others during the past 20 years, a huge level of unconscious bias by non-Aboriginal leaders in this space, and not necessarily with regards to those dedicated and or committed people that work on the ground in a day-to-day capacity with our people, but by some of the bureaucrats from the cities that invariably manage the dollars and cents and make the final decisions. It is obvious there is room for shared management of ranger programs and parks in all forms. It is my personal view that the only way that we as people will have meaningful and fully sustainable control of these spaces into the future is through allowing the people to be involved in the ownership and by default the day-to-day management in a meaningful and integrated manner through the whole supply chain. These programs have and may assist Aboriginal communities to identify land management priorities and opportunities, build community and organisational capacity, and invest in direct training opportunities. The Bunjbi people during the last 5 to 10 years went through a rigorous process of planning and engagement of its community members, using the reality of anthropological and archaeological knowledge that has been built up over the last 60,000 years. I've been really pleased that I was involved in their native title claim because it meant that I had to go through a whole process of immersion in their culture to understand what it was that they were arguing. And when we went through the native title process, we had to show whitefellas things that were secret and sacred. And we had many old men die not long after we did that, and you can understand why people were reluctant to then continue to tell people about those things. In many cases across Australia, land aspiration by traditional owners informs the design and delivery of Aboriginal ranger programs. In West Australia and in the Pilbara in particular, a number of these programs have been driven by mining royalties, which I talked about briefly before, and the traditional owners have asked to use their compensation funds to provide funding for the establishment of these programs. The objectives of these programs are to work with Aboriginal communities to develop and implement successful and sustainable Aboriginal ranger employment programs and to provide new jobs, protect the environment, provide social and economic benefits. To scale up and expand the Aboriginal Ranger program by leveraging funds from other state and Commonwealth agencies, industry and philanthropic groups to increase Aboriginal Ranger employment within the department that is an additional but complementary to the Aboriginal Ranger program. Basically what they're doing is using the traditional owners' funds to supplement government funding. I have some philosophical issues in regards to that oppose that, but basically I suppose from a commercial aspect, in WA the Aboriginal Ranger program provided about $20 million from 2007 over the last sort of 4 to 5 years. There was about 8.45 million provided in 2017-18. Further $9 million was rolled out in 18-19. I'm not sure what's going to happen from further on to that. Their program is seeking using their national parks where they have limited access from a lot of Aboriginal perspective, they don't have the limited access to these parks, but they're still required to put their money in to help run the state department programs, which is a bit annoying from my perspective. I think the people deserve better. What I want to jump to is the funding models that are being used, and I think they're a little bit illusory and fraught with perception problems across different regions. It was noticed by the government that the funding program for the Aboriginal Ranger program in the first rounds of funding had considerable variation in the cost of administration and pay rates for employment of rangers and ranger coordinators and camping allowances. The problematic issue is that the ranger programs to attract staff in a meaningful and sustainable manner in a major issue, many of the young people, Aboriginal people, were in stable relationships. This is a big, wide land. It's 300 to 400 kilometres between every town. Many of these young rangers have wives, they have children, and especially the younger women, that many of the young men are supporting their families. These payments are not sustainable when they can work in a mine close by and earn 15 times more than they're getting paid on the mine, from the mine site. Some of them are getting paid as rangers $200 a day equivalent in a salary, which is not a bad salary, and some people would say $1,000 a week. But when you can earn $600 a day doing heritage work or working in a mine site, you can get paid up to $100,000 a day for labouring and cleaning rooms. That's the problems we have. Knew that one off the top of my head. I didn't need to actually check that one out. Look, I think in 2018-19, the Aboriginal Ranger Program focused on establishing new and emerging ranger groups as well as female rangers. This was particularly in the Karijini area. They established areas where they were trying to create an ambience where the young ones would be attracted. We had more women attracted to it than men, and that was understandable because these women invariably were living out on the ranger station with their families, and they didn't have to go away, so they were there all the time and they were in close proximity. And this happens to a great degree in the townships as well, because it's a fair way from all the towns. Like Tom Price is over 100 k's from the actual national park, and there's not enough sustainable housing out at the ranger station. Most of them are supplied to employees that work in the visitor centre, or they're working in the rangers program. Well, for the mainstream rangers. Look, an additional principle of fairness, I suppose, could be applied to consider geographic spread of the successful projects across the state. They're all very diverse. Some within the Perth region are very close to the city, so much easier to supplement. Separate consideration should be given to applications from new and emerging groups, but the funding, they set one criteria, one formula for how they fund that, and it just doesn't work. Not when if you look at the Pilbara, you look at the Kimberley. The Kimberley goes from one side of the Western Australia in the west to the east, which is several thousand kilometres, and all of the areas are very different. Basically, I'm going to talk about what the conditions and accountability and real sustainable issues are going to be once mining's gone from the Pilbara, and this could be any great commercial impact on Aboriginal heritage or sort of Landcare type programs or ranger programs. In fact, the Mudgee Bunge people, I know them, have a strong spiritual and physical connection to the Pilbara region, the eastern Pilbara region where they come from. They're around the Winternoom. Most people would know what Winternoom impacts. It's the blue asbestos area, and my law boss has actually got mesothelioma. He's going okay at the moment, but this is a fact of life for these people. A lot of the older men I know have died of respiratory illness. Most of them had worked as baggers in the blue asbestos mine, so you can bet that they died from asbestosis, but it was never diagnosed and they never received compensation, unlike this old man. He's not an old man, he's mid-60s. I mean, that's not old from my perspective. But look, you know, the rich cultural and historical heritage that these people work within, especially as such areas of the Manguru, which is the Fortescue River and floodplain, the Carrageenan and Burdalo Ranges, the Willawally Creek landscape and the rock formations where people, animals and characters left traces of their journeys across the landscape. These places are valuable because of the mythological lore, because of past and current use as meeting places for specific ceremonies, as burial grounds for ancestors and places where culture and history was recorded through rock art. The location of these important cultural sites within the natural landscape means that there is considerable overlap sorry, I lost my space. Between Aboriginal and natural heritage on Bunjabit country. The problem we have with the conflict with mining is that in their native title area, nearly 90% of their country is subject to mining lease or development. What's going to be left? I took some old men out there a couple of years ago and they started crying as soon as we drove into the area. Places that they knew and they grew up in and walked around as kids were gone. The mining is, you know, iron ore mining is pervasive. I'm saying it's not necessary, but it's pervasive. Look, I've been visiting Karijini National Park for more than 15 years, and the pure majestic nature of the place always gives my heart an extra beat when I drive into the park. It's, as I said, it was located halfway between Tom Price and Mount Newman, or Newman. It has there's two airports in Paraburdoo and Newman. It is a reasonably difficult place to get to. You've got to want to go there. Bunjabit country is about 1 million square hectares of land. They've been developing a strategic plan. I won't even attempt to pronounce the name they use. Along the Fortescue River plain, Twiggy Forest is the top end of the floodplain. You've got Gina Reinhardt in the middle, and then you've got Rio Tinto and all the other mines on one end. So that is the one area they've stayed out of, is the Fortescue floodplain because of its cultural significance and environmental import, and they haven't found iron ore under it yet. Following protracted legal processes, the native title was determined in 2014 for the Bunjabit people, which was hard fought. We lost a lot of men and women in the meantime. The traditional owners and the relatives of traditional owners working at the Karijini Visitors Centre, which employs about 3 to 4 staff during peak times of April, May to September, October, is only due because there is some accommodation there where previously grandfathers and fathers were rangers on the properties, and because the women were working in the visitor centres, they couldn't go and then kick the people out of the houses. Otherwise, the state government would have probably put extra rangers in there and removed the families. So that's how they've kept connection, because the women are still working in the visitor centre. Even though they're not traditional, some of the women aren't traditional in that country, they're traditional from other places within close proximity. And when I say close, I mean within 5 or 6 hours driving. It is a great place. It's a sort of environment. I was having a talk yesterday about what it is we need in somewhere like Bordertown, where I come from. Is if we had a cultural centre here, it can't be just a visitors centre, cultural centre. It's got to have other things attached to it. It has to have Landcare issues. It has to have ranges. It has to have a whole range of other businesses, tourism type ventures, accommodation, whatever, because it can't be a one-faceted business or economic centre. It has to be multifaceted. And I think it's the same as for any small town in this region. If you're going to have a small business of some sort or a micro business, there has to be a cluster of micro businesses in there so that if one falls over, they all don't fall over. It needs to be sustainable. And there's some of the things we're trying to engender in the Aboriginal and some of my Aboriginal clients that I work for. The Carrageenan Visitors Centre employees basically employed by the WA Parks and Wildlife. The centre itself was built using steel from the local mines, and it's a very unique place. It was done in the shape of a goramano, which is a goanna. So I said I know more of their language than I know my own language. There's a park advisory group which is dysfunctional in the sense that it doesn't meet as regularly as it should. I think that's because, given what the Parks and Wildlife do, they're responsible for it and should be driving that until they give control back. Then the Aboriginal people would be more prone to drive those opportunities. What I'm going to talk about is some of the benefits of ownership and operational control, where First Nations people are working on the protected areas. And I was told here earlier that there's been an increase in the Indigenous protected areas, and with that, hopefully, some funding, which is great, and that's a positive from the government. I can't commend them any more for doing that, because that's needed. But what I've found is there's a national emergence of more women being involved in the ranger program, which I think is fantastic. I think it's well suited. It fits. Women have been the nurturers and the protectors of Mother Earth in a more hands-on factor than even men in some cases. The men have been the hunters and gatherers in some cases, but the women seem to have a better penchant for it. They seem to be better at it in some cases than the men, and I don't see that as an issue. Where the men want to be involved, they are involved and they do good work. And I think the women have a innate sense for doing some of these social and environmental achievements, which is fantastic. There are at least 25 women park rangers groups that are benchmarking and creating exemplars of best practice, and I could spend the next hour talking about how well they're doing and the real impacts of what they're doing, but for not only themselves, but their communities, their children, their culture and their self-worth and well-being. These women are providing not only sustainable economic incomes for their families and but are protecting nature on the front lines, have developed a real sustainable platform for career development, leadership empowerment, are becoming real and inspiring role models to their kids, are involved in the real development of unique skills and knowledge of their country. A lot of them have already got it, but it's just formulating it into an issue or a process where they can hand it down and it's written down, whereas the kids get more educated in that, and the orality of the storytelling is not so much lost, but is not being worked as hard as it could be. There's more than 170 million hectares of land that are in First Nations ownership, and just under half of this area in First Nations protected areas. Many of the landscapes are the habitats for native plants, animals that many are threatened and which require active management to survive. The knowledge, attributes and approaches of women are integral to a balanced approach to working and caring for the land across Australia. And that's something that I've really been looking at, and it's something that really is a great hands-on environment in which, for the young girls that don't want to leave their communities, want to be involved in sustainable protection of their country, can occur. I was reading an article, and Junie Oscar, who's AO, is a traditional woman human rights commissioner who comes from the Fitzroy Crossing region, who I know has stated that human rights on paper and in law are essential, but by themselves are not enough. We need to be able to express those rights through a meaningful life that contributes to our culture, our families and our communities. Women caring for country by working as rangers or in the First Nations protected areas are doing that, and through their work, every Australian benefits, and I'm a great believer in that. And it was heartwarming to hear Junie pushing that barrow. I thought it was really well done. And I'm reliably informed, and it's really code, I suppose. I don't know who did the poll, but there was a poll done that they said that over 80% of Queenslanders believe First Nations rangers to be central to protection of ecosystems across their state, and respondents also valued the employment benefits that these programs can bring. Having spent 4 or 5 years living in Queensland, I'm going to leave a question mark on that poll. There was some right of centre conversations that have taken place during my time that I lived there. Ranger programs which largely undertake environmental conservation employ thousands of First Nations people across Australia. However, they remain heavily reliant on government grants. In fact, in 2017, $30 million of federal government funding was committed to First Nations land management over the next 4 years. If these programs are to be beneficial in the long term, they must become financially sustainable. To do this, First Nations communities need to leverage market opportunities that can create genuine sources of income. Fortunately, there are commercial elements that can be incorporated into many of the First Nations land management programs. Some activities are also being undertaken by rangers, but are also yet to be fully exploited for commercial gain. Backburning of bush and grasslands is one of the most common practices of First Nation ranger groups. However, only a limited number of communities have sought to utilise these business opportunities of this practice in what they call carbon farming. As the carbon market evolves, companies across the world are looking at offset emissions in order to meet government or corporate social responsibility targets. In the Kimberley, the ranger groups are already selling carbon units to companies such as Qantas and Allens. The Australian carbon farming industry is expected to be worth up to $24 billion by 2030. That's a lot of money. And therefore what you have is the big corporates coming in, trying to slice and dice the market, and once again our mob miss out. Okay. What I think is the other area is the Northern Territory, the economic potential for rampant feral buffalo populations. There's over 100,000 buffaloes in the Arnhem Land. There's a meat export, commercial hunting type opportunities. I also think, and this is controversial, I think that crocodiles are on that list as well. And the traditional owners should be the only ones that are allowed to hunt and collect them and have safari type programs. The crocodiles are, that young man that got bitten just the last day or so, he hopped out of a boat and trod straight on the top. Shows you how many crocodiles are up there. I went to a piece of river recently in a pastoral property and I counted 50 or 60 crocodiles just floating around, so they're not scared of anyone anymore. So basically what I'm saying in conclusion, I contend that the more devolved approach by all governments will assist First Nation communities to identify land management priorities and opportunities, build community and organisational capacity and invest in direct training programs, especially from a sustainable cultural, economic and social perspective. We need economic opportunities such as visitor and interactive cultural centres, galleries, accommodation, tourism ventures and the ability to be collectors of revenue for park entrance fees, camping fees and sites and other services across all land tenures. The desired outcome are to work with First Nation communities to develop and implement a successful sustainable First Nations Rangers program, employment program, provide new jobs, protect the environment and provide social and economic benefits to our First Nations peoples in all areas of land tenure. And thank you for your attention today.
Thank you so much. Fantastic presentation. I'm going to open it up to the audience to see if anybody's got any comments, reflections, reactions, questions. I'm just going to get a microphone so I can roam around. So you stay put where you are, Rick. Go on, somebody start me off. How are you all feeling?
Sorry, it was a bit dry and I didn't have a presentation.
Here we go. Dad.
Yeah, thanks very much, Rick. I just want to make a comment. You mentioned the additional IPOs. So the government announced, I think, possibly 7 new land and water IPOs yesterday.
Yeah, someone just said it to me in passing this morning and I thought...
It's about 17 million hectares, includes Oak Valley.
Oh, good. Fantastic.
I understand are coming today.
Oh, that's great. Oh, someone said it to me in passing and I didn't know any more than that.
Oh, I knew it was going to be somebody right at the top. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Thanks, Rick. That was a good talk. Dan Rogers from South Australian Government. I guess thinking about this stuff and the IPAs in particular, I just want to get any comments to make about how traditional owners and traditional land managers might work in the broader landscape, particularly in the more settled areas, more agricultural areas, and just that sort of, working across tenures and that sort of thing, whether you've got some comment to make about that and traditional owners.
Obviously, I can't speak for traditional owners specifically. I know what I've seen. They're pretty happy to be involved, but a lot of the time it's prescriptive. They're told you will do A, B, C, and they don't particularly want to do A, B, C. They have cultural time where they have to go and spend time with family. They do have funerals. I mean, last week in the Pilbara we had 6 funerals. I mean, people don't understand the cultural impact. When you have 6 people die in your communities and you're related over about between Onslow, Karratha, Port Hedland, Newman, these areas, that they're all connected culturally and people just can't get their heads around that. And a lot of well-meaning people don't understand that it is not a 9 to 5 for 5 days a week type environment. They'll work when there's work to be done, and I've been to meetings, people say, oh, they just turn up and then get when they want and they go home when they want. People I work with turn up at 9 o'clock and they'll go home at 6 or 7 o'clock at night and they'll negotiate all day. But, you know, they'll say yes sometimes when they really mean no, or let's think about it. Especially when you're going to give away large tracts of land to be dug, for great holes to be dug in. So somewhere like Carrageenan National Park is the last bastion of iron ore. The whole place is iron ore. You know, that's what it's built on. And from a cultural perspective, it's a very sacred site. But what happens in 100 years' time when they run out of iron ore? Or 50, 60 years' time when they run out of iron ore? Where are they going to go? That's the things that I worry about for my kids and for their kids, especially the chichis out there. You know, what are they going to do? Were they going to have the same drivers that the old people had in developing this new cultural context? Because they don't. You know, you've got to try and make them smart. They've got to be ninty about the aspects of commerciality, the aspects of whether or not you're going to destroy your culture or not. Because that's what happens when you don't have points. That the whole cultural aspect is built around songlines and places and animals and the things that the Landcare is all about in diversity, growing biodiversity. How do you continue to have that connection to country when it's not there anymore?
Okay, I've got time for one more question. I'll just come to you in the middle here.
Hi Rick, thank you for that insightful presentation. Lots of issues you've raised there.
Probably a bit too broad, I'm sorry about that.
No, it's great. And I just want to know what can we do about it? What should we be doing in terms of advocating for increased funding for these areas to be managed? You know, making it more appealing other than mining, to retain, you know, people in country and doing what they, you know, want to do rather than, you know, chasing money. And it's everybody's right to do whatever they like, but what can we do in terms of either Landcare or if we're in government agencies, etc.?
I think, you know, with someone like, and I speak specifically about Karijini, but I think it's equally applicable to even places like Bordertown, is that if you have a cultural precinct, you need to have affordable housing, affordable employment and sustainable employment in any environment. I think they're the three things that people will stay if they have housing, adequate jobs, and from that you get the income and you can work that through. I mean, it's, you know, a lot of these people wouldn't care so much about the money if they had permanent jobs out in these parks and they knew they had a decent house that was going to not fall down around them, or, you know, is going to be there and can be sustainable over a long time, because it's all about family. At the end of the day, that's what we're... Bruce, you had your hand up. You were right down the front hiding.
Very quick. Yeah. Go.
I go turn it on.
You turned it on. Yeah.
Hang on. Unless you can shout it.
No, I'll share it with everyone. Bruce.
Bruce Hammond. I was 8 years involved with Indigenous land management facilitators to IPAs. Look, I really applaud the extra IPAs, but the model's broken. Most of our rangers are working for $25 an hour. They're limited to 3 days a week. That's black work for the dole. I think your economic content there is really important. What Landcare can do is partner with the rangers, identify. We've got people in this room that waited 15 years for a ranger program after the IPA was designated, the first one, and Warren. So what we need to do is make sure there are people on the ground. Our people work out in country, they live on country, as you've said. I think Landcare is a great partner, but we've got to grow from being program and system based to be partner based. Landcare is supremely positioned to actually be a partner in ranger development. It does not need to be a driver around program. The government have proven for 200 years that the program delivery on a 4-year political cycle doesn't work with our cultural law. Landcare can work outside of that. It's private. It has passionate people. We can do it over a coffee table. It is not about the money. It is the programs that are actually restricting the rangers. I left the program 7 years ago. We were 3,000% overprescribed. Oak Valley was on the list then. It's just been declared today or previously. So there's a pile of Indigenous, Aboriginal and Islander people ready to be rangers that have sat in an in-tray in the federal government's office for 7 years since I've left, 15 years. So there's a backlog there that Landcare can actually actively work with, do the private ventures, do the other stuff. So think about growing away from program delivery and being a true partner.
No, I don't disagree. I support it. I support that.
Yeah, I support what you're saying. It's that the reality is that without working on country ranges or ranger delivery with it,
Yep.
the IPAs are empty.
No, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.